Injury updates galore, and there's certainly extra concern around Benjamin Morrison. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome into this episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listener view every day. Don't forget you can subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can follow along on Twitter. I am James Yarcho at JYarcho_Bucs, credentialed member of the media covering your Tampa Bay Buccaneers, here with you 5 days a week along with the everydayers. And for that, I want to share my appreciation for your continued support of the show. One of the ways you can support the show is become a Locked On Bucs insider. You're going to get news, rumors, updates, general thoughts, one-on-one conversations with me via text message. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs or click the link in the show notes to become an insider today. The Buccaneers fantasy focus is coming up a little bit later as promised, but I want to kick off today with some injury updates regarding some of the more prominent Buccaneers. We're going to start this one with a less than encouraging update about rookie quarterback Benjamin Morrison. Now, Morrison has been out for about a week with a hamstring injury, and during Saturday's preseason game with the Titans, Bucs GM Jason Licht was on the radio broadcast talking about that injury. This comes courtesy of Joe Bucsfan, who had a write-up about the interview, and when Licht was asked about Morrison, he said, quote, "Hopefully he's back for the regular season." Yeesh. Todd Bowles didn't add much more clarity after practice on Monday when he was asked whether or not any of the outside corners would be out long-term, since Morrison was also joined by Bryce Hall and Roman Perotti on the sideline. Bowles said, quote, "We'll see. I hope not, but we'll see. Obviously, the corner spot runs a lot, and a couple got nicked up in the game, so we'll see how long they're out," end quote. I do not like this news at all. Of course, before this hamstring injury to Morrison, he was clearly pushing Dean in training camp and making a case to get some significant snaps early on. Now, if he misses the rest of preseason and training camp and doesn't return until the regular season, his chances of playing in those early weeks without an injury pushing him onto the field, that's extremely slim. Those odds are very, very small. I went on a bit of a tangent the other week about the Bucs and these hamstring injuries. So seeing Morrison go down with one is certainly frustrating, but I also have to wonder if this one was brought on by the recovery from a hip surgery and if he was putting more stress on one side of his body to compensate as he continued his comeback. In my mind, that makes some sense, but I'm also far from a medical expert, so it could just be another hamstring injury to go along with the other 12 dozen hamstring injuries that this team seems to have dealt with over the first few weeks of training camp. In other injury news, a nice update on Mike Evans. Mentioned last week that he caught a touchdown pass in the joint practice. He ran straight into the locker room with a trainer. Todd Bowles had talked about it after the practice, but turns out he just needed an IV. No worries there at all. As for Rachaad White, he did injure his groin in the game Saturday. Bowles was asked about it, and he told the media that White is day-to-day with that injury. So it doesn't seem like it's too severe. It will not keep him sidelined for very long. And then Owen Wright was also held out of practice on Monday. Bowles said that he took the bulk of the carries, so he's a little sore and banged up, but didn't offer much beyond that. No update on Dennis Houston and his groin injury, but as I mentioned, both Bryce Hall and Roman Perotti were held out of practice with injuries. Trey Palmer and Cam Johnson still did not participate, but there is some good news. This is not all doom and gloom. Cade Otton and Tez Johnson both returned to practice on Monday. They've both been out for a couple of weeks, so having them back in the mix is obviously a step in the right direction. Otten's spot is pretty much locked and loaded, but Tez is still battling with guys like Trey Palmer and Cam Johnson and Rakim Jarrett, and of course, Ryan Miller, who had an outstanding day Saturday against the Titans as he led them in receptions and yards. And then running back Josh Williams, the undrafted rookie, he returned to practice Monday as well. So there's a lot of excitement around him as a potential practice squad guy. It's the buzz, the excitement around Williams reminds me a little bit of Sean Tucker when he was an undrafted rookie. That didn't really pan out just because his rookie season he spent, working on returning from an injury that he suffered there while at Syracuse. But it's good to have Josh Williams back in the fold now. All in all, it's a mixed bag of injury news, with the biggest questions being Morrison and Rachaad moving forward. Hopefully we're going to get more clarity on that in the coming days. I hate to see both of those guys missing time right now. It hurts Morrison more than it hurts Rachaad for sure. Rashaad's spot is cemented. He's locked in as the number 2 running back on this team. He is going to get plenty of opportunity, plenty of volume, as we'll talk about a little bit later. But Morrison has a lot of ground to make up with all this time he's been missing. And I'm just afraid that it's going to create a situation now where Morrison missed a ton of time in training. You go back, he missed part of mandatory minicamp dealing with that injury as he tried to come back from hip surgery. Now he's dealing with a hamstring injury. And if there's a situation in week 1, let's say it's week 1 against the Falcons, and Jamel Dean is lined up across from, Drake London or Darnell Mooney or whoever else, and he goes down with injury, that would have been the spot for Benjamin Morrison to immediately get on the field and take over that outside corner role. Instead, now does it go to Bryce Hall? Do they move Jacob Parrish to the outside? I don't think they would, but he did play some outside corner against the Titans. Does he move to the outside and Izzian comes in? What is the pecking order now if Dean goes down and Morrison is not ready for live snaps? This hurts in his development, getting those reps in the preseason, getting those reps in training camp. It just drastically slows down the process. And you guys know how frustrated I am with these freaking hamstring injuries. And some guys, it's like, okay, he's down with a hamstring. That stinks. But he's going to be fine. If it's Mike Evans, if it's, Cade Otton, if it's Bucky, if it's, those Antoine, those kinds of guys, it's like, okay, fine. But when you're talking about a rookie who missed his, virtually his entire last season of college football because he got injured, I think it was week 4 of the college season. So he misses all that time, has to have surgery, has to work his way back, finally gets on the field, then starts making some noise once he's back on the field. And now this is going to just absolutely basically force him to start over from where he had built himself in training camp. It's just, it sucks for Morrison. It's bad news for the Bucs. It stinks if you're a Bucs fan who was excited about seeing him. I don't think this plays at all into the injury prone argument. Like I said, this could be related to the hip if he was favoring one side over the other and put too much strain on one side of his body, or it could be the fact that the Buccaneers have the most hamstring injuries of any team I have ever seen in my entire life. So, one doesn't necessarily mean the other. It's just really, really frustrating. As somebody who's currently watching his son work his way back from ACL surgery, ACL was torn in October, had surgery in November, just set foot on the ice for the first time on Monday. And watching that progress, it just stinks when you see somebody who's working their way up to a high level and then have to fall all the way back down and work their way back up. So hopefully it's a speedy recovery for Morrison and it's not quite as bad as Jason Licht said, but alluded to when he said, hopefully he's back by the regular season. Would like to see him back much, much sooner than that. It is time for the Fantasy Focus. That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. It's the best time of the year. NFL kickoff is almost here, and that means fantasy football season is back in full swing. This year, Yahoo Fantasy is turning things up with a fantasy football experience like never before. This year, I am playing on Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too, whether you're a first-timer or a veteran making your millionth league. To celebrate 28 years of fantasy football greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days throughout August. To kick it off, they just dropped Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine Leagues, a killer new way to play fantasy football on Yahoo, where the lowest scoring team gets eliminated each week until there's just one team left standing. With the season around the corner, now's the time to get your league together and give this new mode a try. But if you're more into the classics, you can still play in head-to-head private leagues or join a public league. Stay tuned for more killer announcements and start playing Yahoo Fantasy Football now at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. Thank you again for making Locked On Bucs your first listen review every day. For your second listen, check out Locked On Bets. Betting experts Lee Sterling and Kevin Rogers have daily MLB locks and can't miss football futures. Find Locked On Bets on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, y'all know what time it is. It is fantasy draft season. Every year, I try to take a look at Bucs players and their fantasy potential to try to steer you in the right direction. Last year, nailed it with making Chris Godwin the number one player I would draft on the team up until he got hurt. Didn't do so great on my prediction for Rachaad White, but since all of you are Bucs fans and you're probably in leagues with a lot of Bucs fans, I am here to try and steer you towards who to draft and who not to. So I'm going to go through all of these guys, and then at the end, I'm going to rank them in order of who I would target from first to last based on average draft position. That's a term that I will use a lot throughout all of this. I will say ADP. ADP means average draft position, and that is a formula that is used by taking all of these different mock drafts or drafts that have already happened, putting them into, some sort of algorithm, and then it spits out where these players are being taken on average. So no better place to start than quarterback Baker Mayfield. So Mayfield finished last year as the quarterback 3. He had 8 finishes inside the top 5. He also had a touchdown rate of 7.2%. That is much higher than his previous career high of 5.6. 4,500 yards, 41 touchdowns. That's going to be really difficult to replicate, although he has all the weapons that he needs in order to do it. He's also being drafted at the 6'11". So right there at the 6'7" turn. These average draft positions are based on 12-team leagues. That'll be important, moving forward. So that makes him the 7th quarterback off the board in most drafts right there at the end of the 6th, beginning of the 7th round. Here's the thing. You all know that I love Baker, but I'm not sure he can replicate that level of a fantasy season, and you're drafting him over guys like Jordan Love and Dak Prescott, which is completely fine, but it comes with inherent risk, because if he doesn't replicate that success, the price that you're paying for him is going to hurt your fantasy team. Just as an example, all right? You could take Dak Prescott at the beginning of the 11th round, and then there's still players like Aaron Jones, Travion Henderson, Chris Godwin, Jalen Waddle, Jerry Jeudy, Chris Olave. Those are all sitting there when Baker is being drafted. So all of those guys also come with their own risk, but you're passing on RB2s and wide receiver 2s in place of a quarterback that may not live up to what he did last year, and you're not going to get that return on investment based on the draft position. On the flip side, you could also take Baker at the back end of the 6th or the beginning of the 7th, and you're, believe it or not, likely going to get a similar fantasy outcome as Joe Burrow, who is going in the beginning of the 4th. So drafting Baker, you're basically getting Burrow at a discount, and that may be enticing enough to take that risk, because if he hits for a second year in a row, that could wind up being a league-winning pick for you. Up next, we got Bucky Irving, and this one is really, really tough. Bucky's ADP is currently in the middle of the second round as the 8th running back off the board. You have your top guys, Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, Derrick Henry, Ashton Genty. But beyond that, there's, again, a lot of risk, a lot of questions. Christian McCaffrey, Devon Achane. Honestly, Ashton Genty is a risk as a rookie in an offense that we don't really know how it will do in one of the toughest divisions in the NFL. For Bucky, you're paying a premium for a guy that you expect 17 games worth of production based on what we saw the final 8 games of the season. His weekly finishes in those final 8 weeks averaged let me rephrase, rewind, redo that. Based on what we saw the final 8 games of the season, his weekly finishes in those final 8 weeks, when he played the entire game, was RB7. So he's being drafted basically at the ceiling where we saw him last year. On the year, though, as a rookie, he finishes the RB15, and he had 6 finishes outside the top 24. So that meant in those 6 weeks, he was at best a flex option in your lineup for that week. So the risk reward factor is this. When Bucky plays, you know that he's electric and he can really rack up fantasy points for you. However, he has not been the lead back for an entire season, so you're hoping that he can play at that high of a level for an entire year. So are you willing to risk passing on more proven commodities like Josh Jacobs, Kyron Williams, Jonathan Taylor, James Cook, when we don't know what the timeshare is truly going to be between he and Rachaad White? Plus, I would assume that Sean Tucker will be more involved throughout the season than he was last year. I'll get into it more a little bit later. I was talking to a buddy of mine a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking fantasy. And I told him, I said, I'm not sure that there's 7 running backs that I would take over Bucky Irving. Bijan, Saquon, Gibbs, Henry, for sure. Absolutely. Maybe Christian McCaffrey. The injury history scares me. Maybe Ashton Genty, though I'm a little weary on that one as well. Maybe James Cook, but is he going to replicate the touchdown success that he had last year? I don't think so. I don't think that's even obviously it's in the realm of possibility, but it's just so out of the ordinary that I don't think he replicates that. So Bucky's a weapon in the run and the pass game for sure. So when you're playing a whole or a half PPR, you're going to gain points in that way. I'm probably a little lower on him in standard, but in PPR, I would say that it's hard to make a case for a lot of these other running backs over Bucky since the volume will be there. You just have to realize that if you're drafting him as the 8th running back off the board, you're probably drafting him at his peak. I don't think Bucky finishes as a top 5 running back. So there is that to keep in the back of your mind. All right, Mike Evans is the next guy here, currently going at the beginning of the 4th round. On average, he's the 16th receiver off the board, which is crazy. His consistency is one of the biggest advantages, or so you would think. The problem with Evans is that he'll have games where he only gets like 2 or 3 catches for 40 yards. But then he's going to have a couple where he will win you a week because he has 150 and 2 touchdowns. So week to week consistency is not there. His year after year consistency is. And that's not what you're looking for in fantasy. Other guys going ahead of him right now are players like Garrett Wilson, Marvin Harrison Jr., T. Higgins, Jackson Smith and Jigba, and Terry McLaurin. I'm not sure that I'm taking any of those guys over Evans. Higgins is going to boom, bust, or sit on a week-to-week basis. Harrison Jr. definitely overhyped. Yet again, we don't know what that Cardinals offense is. Kyler is one of the most hot and cold quarterbacks that there is. Wilson, you have, again, major questions at quarterback. Same with JSN and that entire Seahawks offense. McLaurin, he had a career high in touchdown receptions last year. He's sitting out all of training camp because he is demanding a trade or wants a contract or whatever the drama is there. So at the very least, you're going to get a really slow start and a very high probability that he does not replicate what he did last year for Jaden Daniels. So if I'm taking Evans as my second receiver, I'm good with it. I'm not sure I want to anchor my fantasy team to him as a wide receiver one just because of the week-to-week inconsistencies, but I definitely would like for him to be on my squad at the top of the fourth or later. I'm 100% scooping him up. The rest of the fantasy players as they stand now, and which ones should you not leave your draft without? That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs. Our sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action, so why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. FanDuel is super easy to use and always where I go to place my parlays for just about every sport, but I also love futures bets and trying to predict champions across all sports. Right now, the Buccaneers are plus 105 to win the NFC South, minus 144 to make the playoffs, and plus 2,900 to win the Super Bowl. That's behind teams like the Bengals, Vikings, Packers, Niners, Commanders, Chargers, and Rams. New to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Wrapping things up here on a fantasy-focused edition of Locked On Bucs, and it is time to talk about Chris Godwin and hurt my soul a little bit. We all know the questions surrounding Godwin's potentially delayed return, as well as the recent memory of his first year coming off of major injury not being a great one for fantasy football. So Godwin is currently being drafted at the end of the 7th round. And that was after he was the number 2 wide receiver in all of fantasy last year when he went down to injury against the Ravens. He is going behind guys like Chris Olave, Calvin Ridley, Rome Odunze, and Jacoby Myers. Now, in a vacuum, he is far better than any of those receivers ever wished that they could be. However, that's really high draft capital for a player that will likely eat up one of your bench spots for the first couple of weeks, either because he's not active or because he's taking such a smaller percentage of snaps that he's not effective for you in fantasy. So you can make the case that he could be an absolute second half monster for you and lead you into the fantasy playoffs. He can be one of those second half of the year heroes. But that's still a spot where you could draft someone that could help you win, help you every week, in at least the very least your flex spot, or right around that spot. That's where you can take a swing on your quarterback. You have guys like Bo Nix or Jared Goff, even Baker, if he slides about 1 round in ADP, those are the guys that are going around Chris Godwin. So that's a situation where you really have to know your league and the tendency of your league mates. Like, are you going to be able to get away with drafting that receiver at that spot? Or is that where you're going? Are those quarterbacks going to continue to slide to where that spot is? Or you have some guys in your league. Again, a lot of you are going to be in leagues with a lot of Bucs fans. Do you have somebody in your league that's going to be super aggressive and take Godwin a half or a full round early because they're at the turn and they don't want to risk losing him, waiting 20, 24 picks, back and forth? Let them do that. Don't reach for him because somebody else is going to take him. That's essentially my message here. It's just such a high price to pay for someone who isn't likely going to help you in the first couple of weeks. Just like the NFL, you cannot make the playoffs in the first month of fantasy football, but you can certainly be eliminated. So you have to manage the risk reward side and not burn a bench spot just because you love Godwin. Let somebody else take him, be frustrated with him, drop him. Then maybe you can scoop him up off the waiver wire if you have somebody else on your roster that's not working out. And you're like, you know what? I let somebody else burn the draft capital. I let somebody else get frustrated with him. Now I know he's about to be back and he can help me down the stretch. Emeka Egbuka is next up, currently being drafted in the middle of the 9th round, right behind guys like Ricky Pearsall, Jaden Reed, and Jawan Jennings. Look, I love Egbuka for fantasy this year. I am more than willing to burn a late 8th, early 9th on Egbuka, knowing that he is going to be a target monster at the start of the season when Godwin's status is in serious question. Even if Godwin plays, his snaps will be limited and it's going to be situational. This is the kind of guy that you can get later in your draft that could legitimately end up being the top fantasy receiver on the Bucs and the top rookie fantasy receiver this season. He is currently being drafted as the wide receiver 48. Would you rather burn a 6th rounder on Travis Hunter or a 4th rounder on Rashee Rice or a 5th rounder on Zay Flowers, or sit back, load up on other talent in those rounds while those guys fly off, the draft board, and then you snag Egbuka in the late 8th, which is still a reach according to ADP, but this one, just like Godwin last year, who was going in the 6th, it's going to pay off immediately. I am loading up on Egbuka everywhere I can, and people can call me a homer all they want because I'm getting a weekly flex play with wide receiver 2 upside in the same rounds where they're drafting Travis Etienne and Tyrone Tracy. Couple of quick hitters here. Rachaad White, he's being drafted in the 13th round. Yes, that is great value. And at that point, you're looking for upside and opportunity. Other running backs being taken that late: Tank Bigsby, Austin Eckler, Jaden Blue, and Nick Chubb. So we know Rachaad will have fantasy value on a week-to-week basis, and it also gives you incredible insurance if, God forbid, something happens to Bucky. The Bucs had 2 running backs finish in the top 24 last year, so the offense can support 2 startable running backs. In the 13th round, take that dart throw. Jalen McMillan is going at the end of the 16th round. That's virtually undrafted. I'm fine with it, but I'm also not going out of my way to leave my draft with J-Mac. If you need to round out your roster with one more receiver in the final round or two, and you don't already have, 2 Bucs on your roster, I'm a big proponent. Do not have more than 2 players on one offense. So if you don't have any Bucs, or you only have one and you're like, you know what, I still need a receiver, I got a bye week issue here, whatever, go ahead and scoop up J-Mac. He's a spot start. I don't think he's going to work his way into the weekly flex, but we'll see. But at least it gives your bench some depth, and you have the touchdown upside opportunity every single week that you need to start him. Finally, Cade Otton going in the 18th round. Again, that's undrafted. He finished last year as the tight end 13th, so he is not in the startable category. This is a loaded offense. Cade is going to have his opportunities, but not on your fantasy roster. It will not be beneficial in any way if you draft Cade Otton to be your weekly tight end starter. Stream him in a plus matchup if you need to. If your tight end is on a bye, if your tight end got hurt, if he's facing the number 1 defense against the tight end and Cade Otton is matched up against the 29th, go ahead and swap him out. If you're not getting one of the top 4 tight ends in the draft that are going to cost you anywhere from a 2nd to a 5th round selection, then you're probably not going to have the same guy all year anyway. Hold off until the end of your draft. Take a guy like Tucker Kraft or Isaiah Likely there in the 11th or 12th round. Play the matchups week to week off of the waiver wire. So to wrap this all up, I'm going to rank these Buccaneers in order from best to worst for you to draft based on current ADP and the players that are going around them in order to try to maximize your roster with the most talent possible. At number 1, I have Emeka Egbuka. Number 2, Baker Mayfield. Number 3, Bucky Irving. Number 4, Mike Evans. Number 5, Rachaad White. Number 6, Chris Godwin. Number 7, Jalen McMillan. And number 8, Cade Otton. And I just want to say these are not ranked in the order in which I think they're going to score the most fantasy points. I think Chris Godwin scores more fantasy points than Rachaad White does this year. But I think Mike Evans might end up scoring more fantasy points than Emeka Egbuka does this year. The point that of this ranking is to say, if you want to make sure that you get a Bucs player, these are the guys to focus on based on where they're being drafted right now, so that you can get even more talent in those earlier rounds. That's what it boils down to. You want the most talent possible on your roster, and if you're going to hyper target one Buccaneer, that player should be Emeka Egbuka, knowing that you can get him at the 8-9 turn, and it's still a little bit before his average draft position, and it's going to pay huge dividends. That's going to do it for this episode. We will be back tomorrow with Evan Klosky. We're going to get his reaction to we got joint. No, I don't think there's joint practices on Wednesday. Joint practice with the Steelers, I believe, is Thursday. But we'll get his reaction to the game against the Titans. Again, what happened in practice on Wednesday, and of course, what he's looking for in the game Saturday night. Until then, please check out everything going on Twitter at Locked On Bucs, at @JYarcho_Bucs. Follow on Instagram and TikTok at Locked On Bucs at both of those spots. Subscribe on YouTube with those notifications turned on, as well as wherever you get your podcasts. Become a Locked On Bucs insider. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs or click the link in the show notes. If you want to support the show, but you don't want to become an insider, it's real easy. Like this show on YouTube and leave a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. It does help other Buccaneers fans find the show. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding day. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. I want to thank you so much for joining me right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.